This is a story about how a life spins out of control and leads to catastrophic consequences. Elizabeth and John Newton Sr. celebrated the birth of their son, John Newton Jr., on July 24, 1725. He was the firstborn of 4 children, very common to have many children in 18th century England. John Sr. was a seafaring man, captaining slave trading ships to and from the African coasts. The couple's remaining children were born every 3 years after John's birth. John Sr.'s prolonged excursions meant that child-rearing duties fell upon Elizabeth. Elizabeth spent many nights reading Bible passages to John and his siblings. But it was John, as the oldest, who most cherished his mother's nightly readings. His father's long absences at sea only strengthened John's attachment to his mother. At the age of 6, fate crushed John's world when his beloved mother contracted tuberculosis and died. John Newton's mother's death left him lost and confused, but what he did next would put him on a path to near total destruction. And that is where our story begins. His mother's death was a turning point in John's life. At 7, all that he believed about the goodness in the world collapsed. He struggled to recover from his mother's death, losing confidence in the Bible verses his mother read to him nightly. His angry young mind couldn't make sense of why a loving God would take his mother from him. He rejected religion and developed a disdain for all that it promised. Lost and drifting without direction, he decided to go to sea with his father. Since John Newton Jr. was born into a world where slavery was an accepted norm, at the age of 10 he joined his father on a slave ship. The open seas captivated his young mind and made him feel an irresistible pull towards a life of adventure. And without a moral compass, he adopted the habits of his crewmates, drinking, gambling, and blasphemous cursing. However, his dreams of a carefree life at sea were shattered when he found himself forced into service for the British Navy. While on the way to Jamaica, the Royal Navy boarded his ship and pressed him into service. In those days, British naval ships boarded merchant vessels on the high seas and kidnapped any seafaring men they chose. Suddenly, the romanticized notion of being a sailor vanished, replaced by harsh realities. Newton became a slave to the very industry he once admired. As bitter as he was after losing his mother, his new circumstances drove him deeper into rage against the world and the unfulfilled promises the Bible offered. He developed an even harsher view of his fellow humans and life in general. But as bad as life was for John, his attitude was about to make it worse. The Royal Navy gave him a midshipman position, but soon demoted him for trying to desert. Not only did they demote him, they also flogged him, inflicting 96 lashes on his back. The whipping was administered in front of the entire crew. After the humiliating ordeal, John contemplated murdering the ship's captain. Instead, he requested and was granted reassignment to a slave ship named Pegasus, headed for the West Indies. The Royal Navy captain was happy to get rid of such an insolent man. On the Pegasus, his anger, so brutish and blasphemous was his language that he offended everyone on the ship. The Pegasus's crew disliked John. He repulsed them with his insolent tone, arrogant ways, and blasphemous tirades. To rid his ship of John, the ship's master gave him to a slave dealer. The slave dealer, whom John thought he had befriended, had no use for such an arrogant deckhand on his ship. He sent John to his wife in Sierra Leone. She was a hard woman, accustomed to having slaves do the work on her plantation. John soon learned that she cared little about his background and treated him like all of her other slaves. She made him toil from sun to sun in her service, before being allowed to retire to his flat pallet on the floor. He often went hungry, waiting for her to send leftover scraps. She gave him just enough to keep him strong enough to work. He lived in great despair, resigned to his fate. He'd lost all hope, and his anger at what he considered a heartless God raged out of control. After a year of his enslavement, word reached John's father of his son's plight, and he arranged for John's return on the merchant ship named Greyhound. His time as a slave should have moderated his abhorrent behavior, but it didn't. Being freed from a year of captivity as a slave in Sierra Leone should have changed John Newton's approach to life, but as you're about to see, he wasn't ready for that change yet. It would take much more dramatic circumstances to lead him to a different path. On the contrary, it made him worse. He had lost respect for everyone and everything. Rage and blasphemy filled his thoughts, so angry at the circumstances of his life was he. When he boarded the Greyhound to set sail home, he had no idea fate was about to lift its mighty hand and strike him with a life-altering blow. On the return voyage to England, great storm clouds formed around the Greyhound, and the seas turned tumultuous. Violent winds and rain buffeted the ship, threatening to capsize her. The waves smashed the helm, tearing the helmsman from the ship's wheel. John and another crewman struggled to climb the ladder to reach the helm and steady the ship. A giant wave struck the other man, one step above John on the ladder, casting him overboard to his death. John fought his way to the helm, grasping the spinning wheel with his hands. As he later testified, that was the moment of his salvation. Instead of screaming blasphemous tirades at the Lord, he asked God to deliver him from the storm. As wave after wave tossed the ship around, he held on, knowing it was God's answer to his prayer that let him hold on. From that moment forward, he no longer cursed, gambled, or drank. He gradually awakened to the injustice of the slave trade and abandoned it as a career. John began attending church, reconnecting with the Bible verses his beloved mother had taught him. Ministers asked him to tell his remarkable transformation story to their congregations. He became a sought-after speaker at the Anglican Church, the official church of England. He became a minister and was given his own small church. On the eve of a new year, he found himself in need of a message for his working-class congregation that would lift their spirits to endure the hard work they had to face in the coming days. John chose this passage from 1 Chronicles chapter 17 for his sermon that New Year's Day in 1773. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord, and he said, "Who am I, Lord God, and what is my family, that you have brought me this far?" Newton asked himself the same question. He pondered his life's path and the events that led to the moment the Lord touched him. He confessed that at the time he was a wretch. As he sat to compose a song with compelling words to share with his church's congregation at their New Year's Day service, he reflected on his life. Newton wanted the song to have words that would inspire his working-class church members. Gratitude overcame him, and he remembered the moment of his own salvation. He forged a message in the words of the hymn of hope, awakening, and redemption. His flock reveled at his sermon and his new hymn that New Year's Day. His congregation continued to sing the hymn, Faith, Review, and Expectation, along with several others Newton had written. In later years, his hymns influenced English hymnals, but they garnered little national attention in England at the time. Once again, fate was about to reach out and strike the life of the former slave trader. His hymn made its way to the New World, and the words resonated with one group in particular. It became an anthem of sorts for them. They changed the tune, but kept the words exactly as Newton had written them. African slaves sang the hymn while working in the fields and in their humble church services. Soon the hymn became the most popular song they sang. It made its way back across the Atlantic to England, where it gained enormous popularity. So much so that John Newton achieved notoriety himself as the song's writer. The Anglican Church leadership gave him a new position at a large church in London's influential financial district. From there, he preached against what he considered the greatest injustice England had ever participated in perpetuating: slavery. He persuaded a member of Parliament to work with him to ban the slave trade in England. His hymn, known by its new name, became a rallying cry against slavery. You know the song as Amazing Grace. It was a magnificent turnaround for the life of John Newton, the son of a slave trader and a slave master and trader himself. He could honestly say at the end of his life, "I was blind, but now I see." 8 months before his death, John Newton witnessed the abolition of slavery in England. He at last knew he could stand at the pearly gates, meet his Maker, and say, "I once was lost, but now am found." This remarkable story of redemption is a lesson to us all to stay true to our core beliefs. It took a near-death experience for John Newton to see the path forward to change his ways and change the course of history.